Um, Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very, very interesting conference. This is my first visit to Greifswald, and thank you to the organizers for the kind invitation to bring me here. It was quite experience traveling to Greifswald, but I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it very much. And so now I'm going to speak about the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Germany and its impact on security in the Balkans. Of course, this is a huge topic, and it is hard to deal with the topic within 20 minutes limit, but I'll give a try. And then during the discussion, maybe I can clarify some points. I also want to say that I am not a military person. I think it's obvious I'm not a military person, but I have been teaching international relations, human rights, and security issues from the point of view of non-military person. Maybe from historical point of view, contemporary history, from international law point of view. So that's why my angle will be maybe different. Let me start now with some historical background, of course. In the early 1990s, as the withdrawal of Soviet troops from German territory was beginning, events further south in Europe were taking a more ominous turn. The wars of Yugoslav separation at that time spread, headed by Serbia under Slobodan Milosevic, brought death, destruction, and enormous turmoil. For many Balkan countries, the contrasts between these events and the peaceful reunification of Germany in 1990, the relatively orderly withdrawal of vast numbers of Soviet troops from German territory, and the violent chaos tearing Yugoslavia apart deeply influenced perceptions and the institutions needed to bolster European security. In Bulgaria, which has been a member of the Warsaw Pact, but had not hosted any Soviet troops since 1947, the withdrawal of Soviet troops from other Warsaw Pact countries, especially from Germany, and the inability of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the European Union to cope with the violent disintegration of Yugoslavia spurred many to look on NATO and its affiliated entities like Partnership for Peace as the only reliable mechanisms for the future. Today I will discuss how the security debate that emerged in Bulgaria and other Balkan countries was affected by the withdrawal of former Soviet, here I have repetition, sorry for that, of former Soviet troops from German territory and the simultaneous disintegration of Yugoslavia. By August 1994, as the last Soviet Russian forces departed from Germany, the warfare in Yugoslavia was nearing its high. Many experts in the Balkans welcomed the end of the Warsaw Pact and the removal of Soviet troops from Germany and other former Warsaw Pact countries. But they also worried that without a new security architecture to replace the old, violent turmoil might spread throughout the region. It is worth considering how the withdrawal of former Soviet troops from German territory affected debates about the future security environment in Europe. And here I have a map of Yugoslav wars, breakup of Yugoslavia at the time when the decision was taken to withdraw Soviet troops from Germany. In other words, the situation in former Yugoslavia that affected, of course, the whole Balkan Peninsula and all Balkan countries was completely different and very, very difficult to control. This is the situation during that time. We have here a few smaller wars, one very big, the biggest war in Europe, the Bosnian War, that started 1992 and finished with Dayton Peace Agreement in 1995. So the Balkan Peninsula, not only the former Yugoslavia, was under very big stress in terms of security, of unsecurity. So the dissolution, at the same time, the dissolution of the Eastern Soviet bloc and the Warsaw Pact in 1991 gave Belgrade clear incentive to clarify Yugoslav relations with Moscow. Yet, even as separatist pressures began intensifying in Yugoslavia in the late 1990s and early 1980s, and early 1990s, Soviet diplomats and intelligence and analysts seemed not to grasp the intricacy of the situation in Yugoslavia. And here I'm citing a excerpt from a document called the document is obtained from the archive of Gorbachev Foundation that is located in Moscow. It's called I don't know how to translate in English. Thesis about Yugoslavia from July 1991. It's exactly after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. So this is translation in English. The original is in Russian. We should not count on the quick resolution of the crisis in Yugoslavia. The reasons for it are complex, including activation of the old and long-time deepening international controversy supported by the uneven development of the different republics and by actions of outside powers that influence these processes and thereby accelerate the destruction of communist structures and foster anti-Serbian spirits, etc., etc. So the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the impact of the increasingly hazardous situation on Moscow's interests were only tenuously included in the plans and strategy of Soviet and Russian policymakers at that time. For example, in a strategy document from mid-1991, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs highlighted three important points. First, Russian officials believed it was crucial to seek to, quote, preserve the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia and to resolve all the problems of its further development by peaceful means within the existing Yugoslav federal construction. Second, Soviet officials warned that external countries should not intervene in Yugoslavia's domestic politics. All international efforts must avoid interference in Yugoslavia's internal affairs. Only if Yugoslav authorities request assistance should outside powers try to mediate in the situation. Outside powers meaning the most powerful European countries, including Germany, the United States, and at that time, Russia. Third, the Soviet ministry expressed strong support to the role of regional organizations other than NATO in dealings with Yugoslavia. In this sense, we have a favorable view of the steps taken within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the role of the European Union has played and still plays. So even though the Soviet government hoped to preserve the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia, while during the withdrawal, at the time of the decision, when the decision for withdrawal, Soviet forces was taken, withdrawal from Germany was taken. So Soviet officials were looking at the Yugoslavia case and were judging the situation, but one important aspect should be mentioned here, that they were very afraid that the situation that is going on the Balkans can affect at that time Soviet Union and lead to Soviet Union to experience the same violent breakup of the country, although we know that the dissolution wasn't violent. But Soviet military and also political elite and the Communist Party were worried a lot about the situation in Yugoslavia, because in the Yugoslav case, they were seeing the situation that appeared in the Soviet Union at that time, with all the problems that the Soviet Union experienced, not only economical problems. So Soviet officials were clearly aware that Yugoslavia might break apart, but they didn't want the dissolution of Yugoslavia. They wanted to keep the country together, and initially, that was the position of the United States as well, and also of a few European countries. But it wasn't the position of Germany, and it wasn't the position of Austria, which encouraged actually Croatia and Slovenia as leading and the most powerful and economically advanced countries to leave the common Yugoslav state. So this was so Soviet officials. Let me go back to the Soviet perception. Soviet officials were clearly aware that Yugoslavia might break apart. This was evident as early as 1990, reflected in internal documents of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the discussions. And here I'm citing a document. It's in Russian. It's like notes on the situation in the Союз коммунистов, in the Communist League of Yugoslavia. Because it's Yugoslavia, Communist League of Yugoslavia. After its dissolution on the 14th Congress of the, it's again Communist League of Yugoslavia. This document, I found in the Organi. And as many other documents on this period. This document also, and other documents that I'm citing, they show the interest that Soviet Communist Party, but not only the party, but the whole ruling elite, including the military, was paying to the situation, that the processes on the Balkan, the war on the Balkans. And it wasn't because they were kind of, I shouldn't use, but they didn't care that much about the Yugoslavian per se, but about themselves, seeing that might happen at home. Among many documents, also, this is another document that I'm citing, but I would say that the concerns Soviet officials were expressing stemmed in part from their anxiety that the USSR itself might soon be undergoing a similar breakup. So this is the situation when the decision to withdraw Soviet forces was taken. So by the end of 1991, the feared breakup of the Soviet Union had become a reality. The disintegration of the Soviet states occurred at a time when Moscow still had more than 300,000 troops deployed in the Balkan states and in Germany. I think Mark mentioned about not that the Soviet Union had troops not only in Germany, but elsewhere. So the dissolution of the USSR threatened to disrupt the Soviet troop pullouts. In these circumstances, Yugoslavia ranked lower in priority for the new post-Soviet government under Boris Yeltsin than it had in 1990 and especially in 1991 for the Soviet regime. From 1992 through early 1994, the Russian government's main role vis-à-vis Yugoslavia and general situation on the Balkans was through the deployment of a small unit to the United Nations Protection Force, so-called UNPROFOR, spurred by the war between Serbia and Croatia and the three-party war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which tore apart the Yugoslav Federation. Russian officials continued to deal mainly with Belgrade, though they did establish diplomatic ties with the other components of Yugoslavia. Relations with Western countries, especially the United States and Germany, influenced Russia's decision about Yugoslav wars and the international intervention in the region. The Russian government sought to establish a larger role in the Balkans and to take part in diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflicts there, because neither the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe nor the European Union proved capable of mitigating the warfare. The two bodies increasingly looked to the United States and NATO. Both George W. Bush and Bill Clinton were very hesitant about getting deeply involved. But the Clinton, as I mentioned, United States didn't want to deal, they didn't want dissolution of Yugoslavia initially. The US administration was opposing the dissolution, and they, of course, the US administration would prefer to deal on the international arena with one entity, with one state instead of 6 or 8, and who knows how many as we have now, after so many years, that would appear on the international arena, and nobody knew at that time what direction they would take. So it was preferable to keep, for the Soviet Union, then for Russia and for the United States, it was preferable to keep one actor on the former, that means Yugoslavia, not 6 or 7 or 8 different actors trying to play their own role and requesting from everybody to have influence on the Balkans. So, but the Clinton administration in 1993 and 1994 did begin regularly discussing the issue with Russian officials, hoping to find common ground. Russia, as the legal successor state to the Soviet Union and thus a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, it is a fact that we cannot and we shouldn't forget, even now dealing with the situation in Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine. We had a few conferences dealing on the legal aspects of Russian invasion to Ukraine, but one important fact is that Russia became a legal successor state to the Soviet Union, and thus became a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, wanted the United Nations and later so-called contact group at that time that was created to deal with the situation with the former Yugoslavia, including the peacekeeping, as enunciated in the 1993 Foreign Policy Concept. The Russian government was willing to work with other countries on peacekeeping in the Balkans, contributing some 1,400 troops to Sector East of the United Nations Protection Force in Yugoslavia during the mandate from 1992 to 1995. So it's just one of the examples of Russian involvement on the Balkans. At that time, simultaneously dealing with the withdrawal of these forces from Germany. However, the Russian contingent, despite its political significance, was a net burden, and there were cases like the one that I'm citing in April 1995, the commander of Russian force in UNPROFOR, United Nations Protection Force, General Alexander Perelyakin, was ousted from his post by the UN after overwhelming evidence of corruption, smuggling, and other abuses came to light, but there were peacekeeping scandals with Russian forces in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, but they were symptomatic of a larger trend, the extent to which the positions of Russia and NATO countries, including Germany, increasingly diverged. Russia, for example, opposed NATO's ultimatum to the Bosnian Serbs in 1994. That was, by the way, the first ultimatum in NATO's history. And also opposed the follow-up ultimatum in 1995. However, the common strategic goal of ending the fighting in Bosnia and Herzegovina and containing the conflict ultimately spurred all major parties to unite their diplomatic efforts, and then we had Washington Agreement in 1994, and then the Dayton Peace Agreement with all major international actors involved under the leading role of the United States. So during that time, the pullouts of former Soviet troops from the Balkan states, Poland, and Eastern Germany proceeded with only occasional disruption. Russian officials threatened to halt the withdrawals from Estonia and Latvia unless the governments there adopted special protections for the ethnic Russian minorities living in those nearly independent republics. In the case of Germany, Russian leaders pressed for additional funding from the German government, going well beyond what had been agreed during the German-Soviet negotiations in July 1990 and into 1991. In particular, Russian officials sought to have the German government fund the construction of the housing for some 700 troops and their families. The scale of these 700,000 troops and their families, the scale of these requests unnerved the German leaders, who feared that Russian officials would slow down the pullouts unless the extra funding was provided. Russian troops completed their withdrawals from Poland and the Baltic States republics in 1993, and the withdrawals from Germany proceeded on schedule, in part because of concerns that emerged about the dissolution of Yugoslavia. The Russian president had sent troops into several former Soviet republics, Georgia, Moldova, Tajikistan, have mistakes here, one I is missing, Tajikistan and Armenia. Ostensibly for peacekeeping purposes. He began to contemplate using the troops who were withdrawing from Germany for peacekeeping missions in the former Yugoslavia. In the summer of 1994, as the date for the final ex-Soviet troop pullouts on the 31st of August drew near, Yeltsin urged the German officials to join Russia in deploying troops to Bosnia and Herzegovina for a peacekeeping mission. Without acknowledging it, Yeltsin's motive was partly to reduce the influence of the United States and Great Britain in the United Nations Protection Force. In an interview With Der Spiegel in the summer of 1994, Yeltsin insisted that, quote, after all, we, meaning Russians and Germans, are all Europeans, end of quote, and should be, quote, taking greater responsibility for curbing the violence in Yugoslavia, end of quote. He argued that the final troop pullouts from Germany in August 1994 would give Germany an opportunity to play a more active role to, quote, send troops and not just in Yugoslavia. After the final Russian troop withdrawals from Germany, the Russian government continued to seek a close relationship with Germany over the Balkans. Some of the Russian forces who pulled out of Germany were deployed to United Nations Protection Force and later on to United Nations Implementation Force that was set up as successor of UNPROFOR. In this respect and others, the withdrawal of former Soviet troops had a direct impact on security in the Balkans. And here I will stop. Thank you very much for your attention.